Hello and welcome to R&R's Ask the Expert. I'm Kayla McGowan, Editor-in-Chief, and today we're discussing the key role of industrial hygienists in our industry. Joining us is Dr. Alex LeBeau, PhD, MPH, CIH, and the owner of Exposure Consulting in Orlando, Florida. Dr. LeBeau provides toxicology, industrial hygiene, and risk assessment consulting services. He is the former chair of the AIHA Indoor Environmental Quality Committee and the host of the Exposure Scientist podcast, where he dives into topics related to toxicology, industrial hygiene, and exposure to science. A few key topics we're going to discuss are key protocols and hidden dangers in our industry, the use of antimicrobials, proper PPE, protecting you and your customers, and most importantly, the importance of collaboration and understanding to ensure the safe and effective practices are met. Please welcome Dr. Alex LeBeau.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. It's nice to see you again. For those of you who don't know, Alex and I have previously met in one of my previous roles, and when I came on to R&R, I happened to run into Dr. Alex, and I'm extremely excited to touch on some of these topics. So, Alex, tell everybody a little bit about yourself that I didn't really dive into, and maybe the role that industrial hygienists play with our industry professionals in the restoration and remediation space.
Sure. I am based in Orlando, Florida. I've been doing what I've been doing for 17 years now. What I do as far as understanding exposures and risks from exposures to human health, what we call risk drivers, something that may make people sick. So, what I've done in past work and what people come to me and say, can you evaluate the substance, whether it's chemical or biological, identify how it may make someone sick, identify if there are levels that are present that are sufficient to potentially make them sick, and find out ways to mitigate or reduce their exposure so they don't get sick. So it's very much a let's find out what causes people to have health outcomes and ways that we can reduce those health outcomes by different mechanisms of exposure.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? A lot of people don't think about exposure risks. I know that most of our industry professionals do think about it, but there's so much more than that, right? We can't, as restoration remediation professionals, take care of that by ourselves. We have to collaborate with people like yourself, right? Um, Speaking of that, evolution is huge. And how has the industrial hygienist, world, how have you guys adapted to make sure that you're meeting, modern day needs? Right? Everybody wants instant gratification, instant results. What does that look like?
No, I'll say that's a very complicated question, put very simply. So, industrial hygiene has its, I'll say, original roots back thousands of years into the early Greek and Roman times. When you think of people saying that the Hippocratic Oath, you think of what people did as far as what they do for medical professionals, but there was also the recognition that there was a recognition of health issues from exposure even back in Greek and Roman times. Bring that back to the early 20th century when we started I'll say late 19th, early 20th century, we started the Industrial Revolution. We started to understand that there are exposure risks to chemicals that we work with. You just can't simply, expose to people to whatever you want and not have bad health outcomes. And as far as the industrial hygiene profession, the AIHA is the American Industrial Hygiene Association. They were founded in 1939. Industrial hygienists existed before then, but that's when they all kind of got together and said, "Hey, let's form an organization." There's actually another group, ACGIH, is the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, meaning that there are different groups of industrial hygienists that got together for different purposes, and we recognize that there are exposures that are problems. I mean, a lot of the work that was done, a lot of the safety and things were the cause of, I'll say the culmination was OSHA, was identifying health hazards. Now, industrial hygiene has, I'll say, wide roots as far as what we get into. Some people look at us as purely the safety people. Okay, well, they care about how tall our ladder is, or what angle the ladder is, or they worry about hearing protection. But there's also the chemical and biological exposures that we are concerned with industrial hygiene as well. And I think that's important to recognize it. A lot of what we do here is multifaceted. I've heard people refer to industrial hygiene as the ultimate liberal arts science degree because we can do so many different things with the industrial hygiene. There's more than just one or two different focus areas. There's lots of focus areas. And in fact, if you become a CIH, a certified industrial hygienist, there are actually 17 what they refer to as rubrics or knowledge areas you have to have experience and knowledge in before you can even pass the exam. And so there's lots more than just the safety aspect of it. Now, where is industrial hygiene going in the 21st century? That's an interesting question because, again, we've very much been based in industry for years. And as we know now, the industry in this country is getting smaller and smaller. It's being outsourced in other places. So where does the focus of the industrial hygienist turn from back then into now? And there's some industrial hygienists that work outside the country in those, I'll say, upcoming areas. I've consulted for work that's been done in China, where there has been, I'll say, more lax regulations on exposures in the parameters there. And the goal is obviously to help them recognize what the problems are and why they need to do things the way we've done them here. But where would does the domestic industrial hygienists find themselves now? And I think that we as a profession are still trying to figure out where we can, I don't want to say reinvent, but where we can refocus ourselves. You know, there's 21st century technologies that I think we need to more fully embrace to not only get our messaging out, but to help people understand, where our work lies. A lot of it has been in the industry, okay, manufacturing sector, but there's also the challenge of, hey, we are also helping with community exposures as well. And that's where I think our focus has been is shifting from the industry to people that are in the general community because we have that knowledge base to help them out. And from COVID-19 was a great example. We got a lot of guidance that was published for non-healthcare workplaces, just general places, what people are to
Mhm.
help communities. One thing that, and you mentioned earlier, the Exposure Scientist podcast that I have is helping people understand in a 21st century way with these podcasts or videos or what have you, is disseminating our information and trying to get it out there. Now, there are, I'll say, some legacy industrial hygienists that are not, I'll say, fully appreciate the ways that we're trying to get those messages out. There are some that say, well, we are very much focused on industry, but with a current population that is not focused on industry, that's industry is a secondary focus that other areas are, we're having to rethink ourselves. And there are many of us who are trying to do that, which is why I think you and I are having this great discussion because there are ways that we can assist each other with that
Mhm.
transition into I'll say, the new technologies.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's huge, right? Because at the end of the day, we are in a customer service based industry, right? Because we're taking care of our customers. And if we can work together and provide a safe environment to limit exposure, right? I think if we talk about mold, smoke, fire, I mean, there's so many things that our customers are exposed to essentially. And if we don't restore and remediate properly and access and utilize our industrial hygienists, there could be long-term exposure to things that we may have missed, right? There's stuff that you can't see in the eye with your eyes. Testing is required. And I think that that's huge. I think we see it a lot in places like Florida, anywhere there's high humidity where people do have mold problems, people are getting sick, right? And I think this leads to, important legislation movements that are happening with like the IICRC and Normie, and I believe like in I think it's the Change the Air Foundation. There's a couple of key organizations who are working towards that. What role do you as a hygienist play in that, Because I think it's also long term, but it's also, hey, you need to have somebody come in that knows what they're doing and work with people like myself who know how to keep the environment safe, right?
No, I completely agree. And I always say this, that there is no one size fits all model for everything. No one size fits all model will apply to every scenario. So you think of it as far as, for example, I see general guidance that talks about, let's have fresh air intake for everything. Well, if you have a place that's prone to wildfires, you're not going to want to have fresh air intake because if there's smoke that's coming in outside, now you're exposing people to an outside air contaminant inside because you've increased everything to 100% outside air or something. So you have to think of the context of the scenario that you're facing. Different regions of the country have different things you have to focus on. And I think that's important for the legislation as well. Sometimes you'll read some of these rules because I mean, we at AIHA, there's a I'll say a governmental outreach branch where we're talking with legislatures and getting them, I'll say, understanding the rules and laws that they're wanting to write. And sometimes you read them and they're like, well, this is very general and bland. This could mean anything, and they could introduce other hazards that you were not anticipating into the inside space. So that's why I think that both organizations need to, or members of the organizations need to contact or at least have some pathway for communications to say, listen, this is not appropriate for our state. This is not appropriate for our region because different things apply here. As you said, high humidity, cold conditions, lots of different factors influence it. So it can't be a blanket general rule because that just creates potential other secondary downstream hazards that you may be introducing into the indoor environment.
Yeah, I think you hit that one really well. I mean, if you think about like the approach in high humidity areas, the approach in like let's say California, right? They have their intense fire season, and I think we've seen it time and time again where someone may have been running their air unit, for example, their HVAC, it's on and there's a fire. People who don't know that they're essentially sucking in smoke, soot, who knows what else, what type of fire it was into their home. And then maybe there's effects later down the line and they didn't really realize it, right? I think that's huge. Here in Las Vegas, we have fires occasionally. One of my friends actually had a fire in her like subdivision and they were running their air conditioning and they actually had to come have their home assessed. They had to have their contents, cleaned and restored. They had to have their HVAC looked at. And she's like, the fire wasn't even next door. I mean, it was in our subdivision, but our air was running. So, you know, you don't know until they're faced with that, I think. And I think it's important for us as professionals to really look at that. And if we need to have a second opinion and use our industrial hygienists, we can protect our customers long term. And they don't even know the risks, right? But we should know them.
Right. And I think, that's a great example. And I think that, there are going to be extreme examples of this as well. For example, I think it was maybe 2 months ago, there was a chemical plant fire that was in Georgia. And I think a lot of the
Mhm.
local health departments recommended turn off your HVAC systems because there was so much soot and whatever else was in the air. So then homes are going to have somebody come in and test to understand what may have gotten in there, even understand if homes and every home builder is different. You don't know if your home has a fresh air intake outside or not. Your business may likely, but you don't even know about your home. So understanding the design of your HVAC system is important too. Do you have a fresh air intake? Can you turn it off or is it constantly on? Is your home, I'll say, very, very tight? Newer homes usually are tight, but there are instances where maybe you have your windows open, maybe something else is going on. That's how we can come in and test what may have gotten in there, understand what the contamination may be within there, and identify how we can recommend to the customer and the remediation contractor, say, this is what we're looking for. This is what we need to get out of here. How can you help us do that?
Yeah, I think that's key. I know this is probably one of the the question I'm going to lead with next is probably a touchy one for some, but you know, we when we deal with disasters like this, like the chemical plant fire, wildfires in California, and then we have hurricanes and tornadoes and all of those things, there's a key element called insurance. And I think there's guidelines that have to be met for them, but there's also keeping the customer safe, right? And if we're working together, even with the carrier, I think it makes the world of a difference if we take the time to explain why we had to do testing, why we had to remediate and restore a certain way. It makes a difference. And it may take a longer process, but I think a lot of people don't realize the importance behind, like you said, testing and understanding what has been exposed. What we can see is people getting sick at the end of the day, and not understanding why they're getting sick, or hey, something feels off in the space, and they don't understand. And if we don't take that into account, we're not doing our due diligence. But also, I think it's where we have to kind of explain, like we're evolving, and that means that all industries have to evolve, from industrial hygienists to restorers and remediators, even to insurance, and we have to work together, not against each other, right?
Yeah, I think of the collaborative efforts are the important thing, and talking with each other too. I mean, you hit something there, and I express this to everyone. And I'll say I'll maybe even call it the CSI syndrome is what we do in our space, industrial hygiene, is science. We have to collect samples, we have to have them analyzed in a laboratory, we have to interpret the results, we have to apply them to an exposure scenario and understand what the risks are. And science is not fast. There's oftentimes of, okay, let's get in on Monday and leave on Friday. And that's not always going to be able to happen because science does not happen at a fast pace like that. And that's what's, you look at CSI, they get tests in there, and 2 minutes later in the show, they have all their information. That's just not how science works. And it's hard to make people understand that. But that helps with the justification that we can write up to the insurance carriers. Hey, first of all, A, science takes a while. B, this is what the science has told us is going on. C, this is the justification, the risks that may be present if we don't do it the way that the industrial hygienist and the remediation contractor have identified, that you're going to open yourself up later to other issues if we don't take care of it now. And you completely summarized it very well there. Is again, the ultimate goal is to look out for the client and protect the client as much as we can. We're all working together to do that, but we just have to work together in the way that will get us in the direction we need to go. And again, realizing that things don't happen quickly, I think is important because, you know, even some of the stuff I do, it'll happen in a snail space. If I'm running some tests at the lab and for other work that I do, one lab I talked to recently said, my, for this test, my results are a month out. Okay. Sometimes things are slow because of lab loads, the type of test it is, whatever. That just has to be understood by everyone, including the client. Because even sometimes the client will be like, I want this done right away. Well, that can't happen right away. This is the steps we need to. Be there to help the client as best we can, but we can only take them so far if they're not, willing to listen to us. But if we come together as a unified front to them, working together, I think that helps out a lot more.
Yeah, I was definitely going to say, I think this goes back to communication too, right? Not only collaboration, but communication, so that everybody is on the same page. And I think there's a lot of things that take time, right? A lot of people are short-staffed. Also, if there's something going on in a specific area, let's say those who were just affected by Milton and Helene, can you imagine the backlog of stuff that's going on? I mean, it's going to take years for stuff to get where it needs to be. And it's unfortunate, but it's better to do it right than do it twice. That saying, buy it nice or buy it twice. I think it's also, do the work right or do it twice, essentially. And no one wants to do it twice. No one, you open yourself for huge risks and liability. And, it's scary, but I think that's the important role that everybody plays, right? The collaboration, it's a collaborative effort. No one can do it by themselves.
No, I agree. I think the communication and collaboration go hand in hand, are important. And if there are disagreements, let's talk about them. Figure out why they're disagreements. We come at this from a science-based approach. You come at it as let's help the client and mitigate approach. Where are we going to meet in the middle on this? And sometimes I don't want to say that there's compromise, but there may be areas where we have to figure out what's the most important and what's nice to have. And I've seen people argue to the way too far about the nice to have things. And it's like, listen, what is the most important thing we need to do? Let's worry about the other stuff later on. If we get it, great. But let's not worry about those little details when we're missing the big picture in this activity. As you said with the Milton and the other hurricanes, you know, there are, and you brought up the shortages too, there are lots of things to worry about there. Where are you going to house people? There's no housing up there right now. If we're going to be bringing in people for remediation, where are they going to stay? How are they going to get the job sites to do stuff? I've talked to people even before the hurricanes, getting not only staff, but trained staff in the field to understand what they're doing has been difficult as of late to get them to either show up to work or do it, as per what's called for by you as the owner of the company. So there's lots of different factors all at play here, and making sure you're on the right page. Even telling us, hey, I don't have the crew to do that today. All right, let's figure it out. Let's work it out. That's why things, as you said, take longer than you would like them to, but in the end, it's do it as you said, buy nice or buy twice. I like that. I'm going to actually use that from now on. Is you got there are ways to do things, and you just have to follow your typical protocols. You can't rush through things, or else it just becomes a mess.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think, elaborating a little bit more on the role that people like yourselves play in our space, you guys have a special skill set that allows you to essentially anticipate, recognize, evaluate, and control the situation to help with health concerns. How do we help limit exposure during our restoration and remediation processes with the help of industrial hygienists like yourself?
I think again, this goes back to I think the collaboration and communication. We are not there to hinder your job, but we are there to ensure that things are done in a safe manner. Now, I recently wrote an article for the website is discussing the history, and sometimes there's, I'll say, somewhat tumultuous relationships in these scenarios, but with our skills of anticipating, recognizing, and evaluating, controlling, we can anticipate what may need to be done on site. We recognize the hazards that are there. We evaluate them. So that means if you are a remediation contractor, if we come in and say, okay, tell us what chemicals you may be using on site, because we want to evaluate the safety and health. You know, there are times when people said, these are what I use. And we say, well, we don't think this is the appropriate one for this, scenario. I've seen strike before because I've used this for 20 years. I haven't run into this problem. Well, that's when we sit down and say, okay, well, let me explain to you why. Let's figure out, if there's something else that you may be able to use. I'm not saying that, I'm not questioning your knowledge, but I'm trying to help you understand that, there are ways in which I'll say antimicrobials, whatever, may be able to use. EPA has certain rules. They evaluate things under certain scenarios. This is why we don't find this safe. Again, it's all about the safety of the consumer, even your employees and the occupants of the building. Is understanding that we are there to ensure safety of everyone, including ourselves when we're on site. So it's not about questioning your knowledge, it's helping to understand why you may have used that, what else we can substitute it with, because that's one thing we do in industrial hygiene. We anticipate and we recognize there's something else we can substitute in there that will do the same job. Now, that may come with a cost, but that's something, again, we can maybe justify with the insurance company, say, we have to use this more expensive product because of these reasons. And that's how we can work together to get it covered, or at least get it understood by them of why we're doing the things we are.
Yeah, and I think you hit that great because if we want to really talk about the importance of the roles that we play, is we're usually seeing people at some of the worst times in their life, right? So if we can work together and help avoid an even like a worse situation, let's do it, right? I think at the end of the day, we all have our own like professional space where we're the expert, quote unquote. Um, And there's a respect thing, but there's also collaboration, there's compromise, there is so much that's involved in this process, and no one's coming in to say, hey, you don't know what you're doing. It's, hey, this is how we keep our customers, your team, everybody safe in this environment, because the last thing we want is to have a chemical reaction. We don't want to have any issues. I think we've seen it time and time again where people that don't know what they're doing mix ammonia and bleach, or they mix, just things like that, right? If we can work together and avoid situations like that, we're doing our due diligence and really showing, hey, this collaborative effort keeps everybody safe. And we know what happens in our space, but there's a fine line of where we cross over and we have to collaborate, because if we don't, again, risk happens.
And it's interesting you bring that up. And again, we go back to and I'm taking this back to our earlier conversation of different regions. I mean, one of the things that we deal with in industrial hygiene is not only chemical and biological hazards, but physical stressors. There's a lot of different states that are focusing, even I think OSHA. Um, OSHA is definitely focusing on this, but different states are focusing on heat stress. How are you looking at what you're doing as far as remediation in areas where high heat is a variable? That's an area where we have knowledge too, is how are you mitigating those exposures? That's an area we can help out as well. If you drive your guys 10 hours a day in Tyvek suits in an unair conditioned space that has containment, you're just asking for trouble. We can say, okay, well, maybe you should rotate your guys out every hour or whatever. That's how we can help out as too, because we're not only protecting the customer, but we're happy to help protect your guys as well to ensure that they're doing things safe, not only from maybe a antimicrobial application or remediation, but from just the activity of getting the things out as far as what they're doing, what heat they're being exposed to. There's lots of different other factors where we can help out. And I mean, that's use us for what we know. I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to help out how we can, because I've seen some contractors where it's July in Florida and they have guys in suits and we're like, it may be a good idea, to do something else. And like, they're used to it. Now that there are laws coming out, that's not going to work anymore. So how are you going to change the activity again based on the states that have, typically high heat associated with work in those environments?
I was definitely going to say that's like one of those hidden dangers, right? There's heat exhaustion, heat stroke. I mean, things can happen. I think, especially when we're faced with a disaster situation, oftentimes we think, oh, we need to fix this now. Like it's a hurry, and safety. Um, a lot of things get kind of thrown to the wayside, unfortunately, but it's in every profession. It's not just in our industry, it's first responders, it's everybody, because there's a sense of chaos and panic. And as a public service professional, you want to take care of these people and make sure that they're safe. But sometimes you need to slow down. I mean, you need to slow down and just really look at the situation as a whole. So how do people like prepare and plan for this type of stuff, right? I think that's one of those things. Preparedness is huge. It can save you some time. So what are some things that we as professionals can do on our side in the restoration and remediation world, to work alongside people like yourself, in the industrial hygiene space?
It's interesting that you brought that up. There's the heat stress, and I'll go back to your previous example. There's a heat stress, but there's also cold stress that you have to worry about. So if you're sending your guys out, let's just say to North Carolina, and you're like, well, there's no air conditioning and there's no indoor space, it's going to be hot. There are recent reports in the last week or two where it's freezing up there. It's snowing. So did you send your guys out to the field expecting high heat and humidity, and now they need blankets and jackets? So what we do as industrial hygiene is, again, we anticipate, recognize, evaluate, and control. We anticipate. We look, and I'm not saying that other people don't do this, but we have that experience to look beyond the moment. Okay, well, let's check the forecast for the next, few months. Let's check the historical. Let's see what's going on. What are the unanticipated hazards that you may be dealing with out into the field where you're deploying your guys? Okay, I've seen instances, or I've seen some reports that say, from this flooding that was going on in North Carolina. There are areas that were, I'll just generally refer to them as legacy contamination sites. There may be areas where there's contamination or or plumes of chemicals in the ground that have changed where they were because the amount of water. Are you, what is the potential for those chemicals to be where your guys are working now, where they're remediating? Is there any other contamination you were not expecting in that remediation space? I down here in Florida, I bring it up often is, hey, wildlife is a big concern down here. Whatever came into the indoor space from flooding waters, you don't know what to expect. There may be snakes in there down here. There may be alligators down in there somewhere that you're not even anticipating until you get in there. So that's how we help you out. Listen, these are the different, I'll just say, wildlife hazards that you have to look at when you're going into those spaces, just so you're protected as well. Um, as far as other uh, ways that we help them, listen, we can help. Lots of people in this area work with personal protective equipment. We can help you understand what the appropriate personal protective equipment is for those scenarios. If you're working with area where we may have a chemical hazard, okay, well, now we need to have a chemical filter on your respirator. We need to have chemical resistant boots. You may have chemical resistant gloves. So we look at everything from a holistic side and say, okay, these are the potentials you need to be ready for. It may not show up, but we can go in there and do testing and say, okay, our tests show this. Maybe we need to bring out these pieces of equipment. I mean, I've got a storage unit that has lots of different equipment in there based on the scenarios that we may face just because of we don't know what's going on in the field. So it's almost like being a Boy Scout. It's always be prepared for anything and just have it ready. So if you're there and you need it, you have it ready to go.
Yeah, I think you touched on a huge point too when we get into that PPE world, right? Sometimes the approach is maybe incorrect. I just had somebody write a piece about hoarding, right? And what brought this piece up was someone posted a video. It was a YouTube video, and they were, handling a hoarding situation, zero PPE. When I tell you zero, I mean they were no gloves, no, I mean, it was horrible to see. But that's where we have to work together. Like you said, there's chemical filters for respirators. I mean, there's different types of PPE for different scenarios. It's not like you said, a one size fits all for everything that we do. We see stuff all over the spectrum, from fire, mold, trauma, right? We have illicit drug issues where we go into. That presents a whole different scenario,
Oh,
right? Can you
yes.
talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So understanding that, I mean, that's a whole different scenario. Is, depending on the type of illicit drug, there are some instances where you can do tests on different surfaces to see what can be saved and what other ones. Depending on the drug, you may say, we're not saving anything in here. I've dealt with hotels that where they identify that someone in the room use something and is like, we're not even going in there, we're just remediating the whole thing. But it has to be done correctly under containment, have your guys, tested, understand, in those scenarios where you may say, we're going to presume every surface is contaminated and you should treat it as such. That's the scary thing about those scenarios is you may not even be able, like you talked about earlier, it's some things you can't see, but you have to know and understand. And when it becomes to certain illicit drugs, fentanyl is something you have to be concerned with. If that's a suspect thing, then it's a whole different protocol your guys have to follow. And there has to be some training too for them to understand. You can't just, oh, you walk out of the containment and suddenly you pull your hat down and wipe your brow with your hand, and then, anywhere could be a dermal uptake scenario or situation. So there are certain protocols that you're going to have to follow for those because that's a whole different ball game. If you're talking about, there are some that are meth houses, but if you're talking about fentanyl and meth and other drugs, there's certain ways to safely do it. There's no real, I'll say, defined protocols anywhere out there. There's ideas or recommendations, but no, I'll say, regulatory body says this is how you have to do things. So consulting with someone who has done that with industrial hygienists or someone to understand that there are definitely risks that you need to be prepared for, even to the fact that, okay, What if one of our guys starts showing symptoms? What are the symptoms? And what do we do if he starts showing symptoms? Have somebody ready, know where the nearest hospital is, those kind of things that we would help prepare for because you just don't know. And again, going back to always be prepared, that's the things we look for because those scenarios are definitely scary.
Yeah, that's definitely scary. And I think even if we're looking at, like the most recent hurricanes, everything from the water to homes and everything in between were contaminated. They may not have been the same contaminants, but there was definitely a hazard, right? And I think you kind of touched on that a little bit too. You have animals going into your home, you have sewage, right? Let's be
Mhm.
real here. There's sewage going, any lines could have broke during that time. I know there's a huge thing with electric cars, right? And the reactions that they're having. I mean, there's
Oh
just
yeah.
so many layers. And as professionals, we can be exposed and more than likely are going to be exposed if we're not taking the right steps. And being prepared and having these relationships makes a huge difference because you can attack it from all different angles instead of just going in and saying, "Hey, we need to help these people." It's bigger than that. Preparedness is huge. I think oftentimes we see, I mean, we see it with first responders too. They rush into the scene. That's their job, right? You rush into the scene and someone gets hurt um, because of the lack of preparedness or just taking a second.
And I think that that's been one of the big things that's been a focus over the last 20 or 30 years on those emergency or first responders is taking a second to breathe. You want to get in there, but let's take a second. Let's figure it out first, or at least be prepared. That's why, we have these rules and laws for community right to know, notifying the local fire department of what's there. So if they show up at 123 Main Street, they understand that these are the risks that are present at, that address to go in there. They're taking a step, they're reviewing their information because rushing in, yeah, is there's always and I lots of people get stuck in this trap. There's always a want to do something. We got to do something. Well, sometimes doing something is the problem also, or contributing to the problem.
Yeah.
Taking a breath, understanding what the downstream effects are of you doing something, figuring it out either beforehand or right before you go in there is paramount. As you said, there's lots of different hidden um, hazards that may exist. The sewage one is gross. Maybe you're not maybe you sent your guys with steel-toed boots. They need steel-toed rubber boots. And they weren't prepared for that because they weren't expecting to be exposed to sewage in there. So again, understanding all the potentials, I'll say all, the majority of the potentials, the biggest potentials is what we can assist with. And we're happy to do that.
Yeah, and I would definitely say too, when you walk into a situation, especially let's say Helene and Milton are on top of mind, right? The chemical plant it's up there. And this goes back to not being able to see everything, but I think a lot of people were so quick to go back down to the beach and walk around with no shoes on, right? They don't understand. And what role can we play in that? How do we go beyond the built environment and work together? I think that is also our due diligence too, because we're seeing it in the indoor environment. If that's the case, the sand that's in your home is also outside of your home. And what steps can we take to make sure that we are kind of extending that to make sure people are staying safe and they're aware?
I think, and this honestly, I think is one of the challenges that industrial hygienists face as well. What we are doing here and I feel like it's communicating with the public beyond just the echo chambers that we do in our own professions. I like to go talk to people outside. If I ever got the opportunity to write an article for a local newspaper or whatever, communicate this is what we do, this is how we evaluate hazards. Go talk to local organizations, see if you can get in there and talk to them and say, listen, this is how we recognize hazards. This is how we deal with these remediation activities and how we reduce your exposures. Uh, Dealing with the 21st century communication issues, I think, is very difficult. I'll say for lots of different professions. I know it is for the industrial hygienist. Is getting out there because we all know when we talk to ourselves, we all know what the issues are, but that doesn't help other people know what the issues are.
Yeah.
Going out there, even being, I'll say, um, a good client to your customer is, they'll talk to you to other people. They'll say, oh, if you're having that problem, maybe so and so can help. Doing a great job for them is going to be great marketing for you too, and helping
Yeah.
people understand and identifying it. For hurricanes a few years ago, AIHA put out a notification said, hey, if you want to talk to some of our experts, we're here to help. Even getting with your professional organizations and putting out news notifications, or at least going on there. I think a few years ago, I was even interviewed on the radio. Reach out to your local radio stations or what have you to say, listen, this is how we can help. I'm free. I'm happy to talk to you to let your people, your listeners know how we can help them out in these scenarios. Because I think it's very much an outreach problem and figuring out how you can in your community, I'll say, navigate the 21st century outreach to those people to let them know how we can help them out is the best thing to do. But again, it's not a one size fits all model. You
Yeah.
know, we're doing it in the podcast space. There are people that do it on the radio. There are people that go on TV interviews. It's getting that information out, but making sure it's good information that we're getting out to those individuals. And it's a continual challenge. You've probably faced it as well. But keeping it up is the important thing. Don't let it, stop because it's a constant reminder. It's like advertising. It always has to be there in mind or people forget it.
Yeah, I was definitely going to say you said that so well too. It's we have to remember how many generations we're touching too, right? We have the generations that are more newspaper based, mail based, radio based, news based, and then you have people in the middle that kind of, watch all avenues, social media, they watch the news, they're looking at Yahoo, Google News. I mean, they're looking at all of it. And then you have the younger generation who is not news focused, more than likely not radio focused, um, probably very rarely TV focused because we have great things like on demand television. And they're reliant on social media. And the dangers of social media is, like you said, maybe not the right information shared. So we're fighting that constant battle of it takes time, it takes multiple touches, but you're also competing, right? We know the space negativity gains more traction than positivity. So it's hard, right? But like you said, you cannot stop. You have to keep pounding that pavement to ensure that you're showing, hey, we're here. And even if you only touch a couple of people, you've made a difference. Word of mouth will happen naturally.
Right. No, I agree. And I'll just share this anecdote. The other day, I heard someone who was, I think, in their early 70s. It said, I don't have a computer. It's 2024, and there are still people who do not have computers. So I
Mhm.
think that's very important to understand. As you said, with newspapers, with TV, they get their entertainment information or otherwise from other mediums besides a computer. And you think 20 years ago, they were in their 50s, they still had access to computers and the internet, but they didn't do it. So there are still different ways you have to reach people in different avenues. So don't focus on one. I mean, there's a lot, as you said, there's lots of different ways we have to get those multiple generations. Because I'm sure in 20 years, there's still going to be people who say, well, I'm in my 70s and I don't have a computer. It's just the way of the world. There are just those people. So focusing on different avenues, as you said, word of mouth is going to be a great one.
Yeah, and I think again, this all comes back to collaboration. Everything comes back to collaboration, communication, unity. You know, there's going to be sacrifices, like we talked about a little bit earlier. There's going to be compromise in some space when we are collaborating, because that's just the name of the game. No one is ever going to get everything that they think or need or want just based on science, based on safety, based on health. So I think that's one of the key things that we as professionals on either side of the ball have to understand.
No, and that's a great point. And I'll say this, now Florida is different. Down here we have licensed mold assessors and licensed mold remediators. I'm a licensed mold assessor. So I can't, I'll say recommend a company for remediation, but I can say, I know these people are available and I can give two or three options for the people to reach out to. But if the remediators and the industrial hygienists, they get to know each other, there can be referrals there. Hey, I know these people. I've seen them do good work before. You may reach out to them. I don't have any affiliation with them, but hey, I know they do good work. Here's their name and contact information. Same thing for us. They may say, hey, do you know anyone in this space, industrial hygiene and the remediation contract? And say, yeah, I know these people. So it's not only the customers, but it's each other who could be our own referral systems for people to increase that network. And I think that's a great area for us to be in as well, is, we can each be our own advocates for our own needed basis for our customers.
Yeah, I think that's great. It's one of those things, referral is huge in the space, in the world, actually, in general, because most times we're consumers, right? We all wear a consumer hat in some way, shape, or form. If you're looking for something to eat, everybody can relate with this example. If you're looking for something to eat and there's like a new restaurant, you may look at the reviews, but you're also going to rely on your network and say, "Hey, have you eaten here? What's your experience?" Right? Because
Right.
reviews don't always tell the truth, and you're like, I'm trusting this person that doesn't know my palate, that doesn't know the ambiance I prefer. So I think referrals are huge, especially if your customer is satisfied with the work you're doing. The referral
Mhm.
you're going to give is going to meet your expectations, and they already know that they're going to be in good hands. Even if you give them 4 or 5 examples, they're going to be able to look and say, okay, there's pros and cons to this one, there's pros and cons to this one. And then it also opens up a door for them to say, hey, these are the three that I've narrowed down. I have questions, and you could potentially answer questions before they even get to where they need to go. And I think you build that trust. I think at the end of the day, that's extremely important because let's face it, in the space that you live in currently in Florida, natural disasters happen quite often. I mean, you guys have rain almost every day, and you face hurricanes, you face all types of different things, right? I mean, you've got animals coming in and out when there's flooding, and you know, you're constantly having to evolve, and customer satisfaction and building a lasting relationship is key, I'm sure, right? Uh,
Yeah.
Same in California, they see fires all the time. I'm born and raised in California, and it got really dry in the summer. That was just the name of the game, right? We'd have Indian summers and fires would outbreak. I don't know how many times we packed up family members' homes, loaded up trailers. Um, and it happened all the time. It wasn't like a one-off instance. And so if we have that go-to, hey, this has happened, whether it's you as an industrial hygienist or it's a restoration contractor, at the end of the day, peace of mind and taking care of the customer is at the forefront. And if we can do it together, it just makes things so much easier. We're not having to, like I said, do things twice. Or, let's be real, face the unfortunate foreseen lawsuit, right? That can happen too if we're not doing it right. You open up yourself to a bunch of legal liability if you don't do things correctly, because then maybe an industrial hygienist is involved after, and it's like, hey, this wasn't done correctly.
Yeah, I've been involved in those too. Is, hey, if or even during the process of, hey, these were my recommendations. These were the top priority and nice to have. And if they don't follow the top priority, that can be a factor in those. It comes to, why didn't you do this? Well, because I didn't feel like it, I don't think is a good enough reason not to. So, it's again, it's working together for the customer, but it's also limiting your liability as well. Again, we're all working together to ensure things are done correctly and safely, so we don't have any problems in the future. And as you said, those lawsuits can't be a future problem.
Yeah, yeah, most definitely. And I think, you cover some important pieces of our collaboration in your upcoming article. So, everybody listening, I hope you take the time to read this and understand the importance of a relationship being built between us as contractors and professionals in the space with industrial hygienists like Alex. I think it's a huge benefit for not only ourselves and our worker safety, but also our consumers. The people we serve at the end of the day, their safety matters. And we're going into these spaces too, right? We have to remember that as well. Businesses, we're walking in and out of them. And, understanding the hidden dangers or, utilizing the anticipation and, expertise of industrial hygienists can make a world of a difference in the work that we do every single day. So, Alex, any last words, any last thoughts that you'd like to share with everybody who's watching?
I think we've covered a lot of great topics here today. Again, the ultimate goal is communication and collaboration with each other, and understanding that we all have our own strengths, and to play off of those and to use them to the benefit of the client. And I appreciate the time here today, because it's a needed and a very illustrative discussion to show that we can all be in a space together and all be on the same side.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I look forward to having you on again in the future. I'm sure there's going to be something that happens that we need to talk about the importance of collaboration and really the indoor space, right? Whether it's day-to-day things like, mold or a flood or a natural disaster. I think there's so much more that we can cover. And I really appreciate you taking the time. And I hope everybody enjoyed all the information that was shared today. And as always, until next time, we will see you on the next episode of Ask the Expert. Have a great day.